Welcome back to part 3, the last part of lecture 4. We're going to work our way through the cardiac cycle and examine how the shifting electrical vector produces each component of the EKG waveform. So recall that the EKG instrument records voltage on the y-axis as a function of time on the x-axis. All of you probably recognize the shape of the EKG waveform. It's composed of 3 parts. The P wave, which is produced by atrial depolarization, followed by the QRS complex, which is produced by ventricular depolarization, and finally the T wave, which is produced by ventricular repolarization. Also important are several intervals: the PR interval, the QRS interval, the ST segment, and the QT interval. If we recall that the EKG is recorded on a strip chart recorder over time, we can see that the recording paper has a large dark box, and each of these large boxes represents 200 milliseconds, 0.2 of a second in the x direction, and ½ millivolt in the y direction. Each of the large boxes is in turn divided up into 5 small boxes, and so each small box represents 40 milliseconds. So let's go through the cardiac cycle, and we begin in diastole when all of the myocytes of the heart are polarized, and there is a uniform positive charge on their surface, and as a consequence there is no electrical vector at this point in time. So let's identify the electrical events which give rise to each deflection on the EKG. We start with the SA node firing the spark plug of the heart, and this triggers a wave of depolarization across the atria that has an electrical vector that is pointed downward and to the left. Remember, the vector always points to the area of net surface positivity. Since the electrical vector during atrial depolarization is pointed downward and to the left, it is in line with the lead axis for lead 1. And so we produce a positive deflection on the EKG, which we call the P wave. And the P wave is relatively small because the atria are rather thin-walled structures. Fewer myocytes give off less electrical current. How would the P wave appear in lead 2? Well, the P wave is even better aligned with the lead axis 2, and it would give a slightly larger positive deflection on the EKG. As excitation traverses the AV node, it is delayed momentarily. And although the atria are uniformly depolarized with a negative surface, and the ventricles are still uniformly polarized with a positive surface, there is no vector because the atria and the ventricles are electrically insulated by the fibrous skeleton. So the P wave returns to isoelectric. So the first part of the ventricle to be excited is the septum, from left to right. And since now the electrical vector is traveling downward and to the right, away from the positive pole of lead 1, we get a negative deflection called the Q wave. How about in lead 2? In lead 2, we see a little or no downward deflection because the electrical vector of septal depolarization is pointed almost perpendicular to the lead 2 axis. As depolarization progresses down the conduction system, it excites the lower septum and the apex. And now the large muscular ventricles are involved, especially the thicker apex. So now the vector is large and pointed downward to the left. And now lead 1 records a large upward deflection called the R wave. How about lead 2? The electrical vector for apical depolarization is even better aligned with lead 2 than it is with lead 1. So we even have a larger upward deflection, which is still called the R wave. Next, depolarization continues to spread, involving the entire right ventricle. The last portion of the ventricles to depolarize is the superior left ventricle. Notice that the excitation spreads from the endocardium to the epicardium. And the resulting vector is large and pointed to the left hip, and producing the final phase of the R wave. How about in lead 2? Lead 2, about the same vector is recorded as the R wave. And notice that lead 3 does not see this large vector well because it is nearly perpendicular to lead 3. In fact, It is pointed away from the positive pole a little bit from lead 3, so it records a negative deflection, which is now part of the S wave. The last region of the ventricles to depolarize is the superior portion of the left ventricle. And notice that the depolarization occurs from endocardium to epicardium. Therefore, the vector is pointed upward and to the left. And lead 1 will record this vector as a smaller positive potential. Now you might note that the strip chart recording shows a decreasing potential, but it is still positive. So at this point here, it is still well above isoelectric, recording this potential here. And how would this vector look in the other leads? Well, in lead 2, it is pointed toward the positive pole, but it is smaller. So we're recording still a small potential above the isoelectric. And in lead 3, it is pointed away from the positive pole. So we record a strongly negative potential, which is a part of the S wave. And once all portions of the ventricle are fully depolarized, current flow ceases and the EKG returns to isoelectric. Why is there no current flow? Even though the atria are fully repolarized and the ventricles are uniformly depolarized, there's no current flow because the atria and the ventricles are electrically isolated by the fibrous skeleton. So we return to isoelectric. No current flow between the atria and ventricles. So all leads record isoelectric. And finally, the ventricles begin to repolarize. And we'll throw you for a loop here because you recall that the depolarization occurred from endocardium to epicardium. Well, it just so happens that the repolarization occurs from epicardium to endocardium. So if we look at the electrical vector, it is still pointed downward and to the left. And now we record a positive deflection, which is the beginning of the T wave. Lead 2 would also record a positive deflection as the T wave. And lead 3 would record a slight negative deflection as the beginning of the T wave. And finally, the ventricle becomes uniformly repolarized. The atria and the ventricles are now fully repolarized, and we return to isoelectric. How come we didn't talk about atrial repolarization? Well, it really doesn't appear on the EKG. How come? There are 3 reasons. First, the atria repolarize at a time when the ventricle is depolarizing. So atrial repolarization is hidden in the QRS complex. Second, in contrast to the ventricles, the atria repolarize in a very diffuse, non-uniform manner. And so there is a very small electrical vector as the atria repolarize. And third, because the atria are thin-walled, there just is not nearly as much muscle mass, as many myocytes participating in repolarization, as there are in the ventricle. When you record your own EKG, you'll probably look at the recording and say, my waveform doesn't look exactly like those in the textbook for a given lead axis. Well, no 2 people have the same EKG. Take a look at this palette of photographs. It's fairly obvious that all of these people can be distinguished as different. They all have a recognizably different face, right? Normal inter-individual variability. However, you would all recognize the following faces as abnormal, right? Normal inter-individual variability can be distinguished from abnormal. Clearly, these faces are abnormal. And in the same way, everyone's EKG is going to vary a little bit, but an abnormal EKG can be distinguished by a waveform clearly outside normal parameters. Although we call this a QRS complex, a Q wave, an R wave, and an S wave may not always be present in the same complex. A Q wave always refers to the first downward deflection, if there is one. An R wave always refers to the first upward deflection. And an S wave always refers to the downstroke that follows any upstroke. So here are examples of complexes that may lack Q, R, or S. Here we have one that has all 3. Here is a little bit different shape where there is no downward deflection of S below isoelectric. Here is no Q wave, but an R and S. And here's just an R and S with no downward deflection at all. And here's an example of QRS with just a Q. So the shape of the QRS differs between different leads. Think about why that is so. So now let's turn our attention to intervals on the EKG recording. We'll consider the PR, the QRS, and the QT intervals. Cardiologists pay special attention to the PR interval. This tells them time required for the impulse to travel from the SA node through the atrial muscle and into the AV node, and then to cross the AV node into the ventricular conduction system. So you can see that the PR interval largely reflects AV conduction delay. In other words, the functionality of the AV node. Remember, one of its principal functions is to delay the impulse as it travels from the atria to the ventricles. And this, in the normal, healthy heart, should be somewhere between 120 and 200 milliseconds. And this represents 3 to 5 small boxes on the EKG. We're not only concerned about whether AV conduction is occurring with the appropriate delay, the second question is whether AV conduction occurs always, sometimes, or never. Another very important interval on the EKG recording is the QRS interval. The width of the QRS complex reflects the speed of ventricular excitation through the conduction system. For a narrow QRS to be produced, excitation must be distributed through the ventricles rapidly. And this can only occur if the impulse is distributed properly by the His-Purkinje conduction system, in other words, the ventricular wiring system. By the way, the impulse can only enter the ventricular conduction system via the bundle of His right here. So an impairment in one of the septal bundle branches, for example, would result in a widening of the QRS. And we will revisit that concept in a later lecture. The last interval that we want to emphasize is the QT interval. And this is the portion of the recording that starts at the beginning of the Q to the end of the T, the end of the T. And this reflects the cycle of ventricular depolarization and repolarization. And so the QT interval defines electrical systole, which is similar but not quite identical to mechanical systole. As you would predict, the QT interval varies somewhat with heart rate. And the QT interval corresponds to the action potential of a ventricular myocyte. So note that the phase 0 upstroke of a ventricular myocyte corresponds to the beginning of the QRS complex. The ST segment here, from here to here, corresponds to phase 2 of the ventricular myocyte action potential. And the T wave, of course, corresponds to ventricular repolarization, phase 3. But most importantly, the QT interval from here to about here reflects the time that the ventricles remain depolarized and refractory to another stimulus. In other words, the effective refractory period. And that concludes Lecture 4. Thank you for your attention.